issue is race, a crisis in black and white. With Phil Donohue.
In the wake of South Central, in the wake of incendiary collisions between races, religions, and ethnic cultures, America still finds right in front of its nose the issue that was here when we were founded, is here today, and will be here for how many tomorrows? The issue is race. I greet you from the Cambridge Multicultural Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we have assembled a distinguished group of activists, scholars, and policymakers to help us make sense of what may be the nation's most important piece of unfinished business. By way of introduction, our panelists are Alan Keyes, the Republican candidate for the United States Senate in Maryland; Richard Nathan, head of the Rockefeller Institute of Government at SUNY Albany; rap musician and activist Sister Souljah; author, educator Jonathan Kozol; performance artist and playwright Anna Deavere Smith; Boston University President John Silber; Mayor Sharon Pratt Kelly of Washington, D.C., and Dhoruba Bin Wahad, an activist and former Black Panther. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin what promises to be a very spirited discussion, may I call your attention to the work of Paul Salmon, the business correspondent of the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, who gives us this opening look at the issue that won't go away. The issue is race. Mr. Salmon.
Let's begin with a question that may seem a little callous at first, but that increasingly lurks behind the national debate on race and poverty. Morality aside, why should those who don't live in the ghetto care what happens to those who do? Or as the question is sometimes put, if these people, by which white people often mean black people, especially that small minority of young black males, if these people want to trash their community, aren't they just destroying themselves and not the economy as a whole? Now, as a business correspondent, I think of problems in terms of economics, costs and benefits. So to the question, why should we all care, we've performed a sort of crude cost-benefit analysis, starting with an economic benefit who says he could just as easily have wound up a cost. Hollywood's Robert Townsend is the writer, director, and star of Meteor Man, a new film he's now in the process of editing. It's about a reluctant black Superman trying to clean up the inner city.
At this point right here, they're going to lay in, special effects will lay in the meteor behind me. So right now I'm running away from nothing, but...
Townsend grew up in a crime-ridden Chicago housing project. He financed his first film, Hollywood Shuffle, on credit cards.
Cut. Yeah, put those on, please.
On location in the roughest part of Baltimore, Townsend's a clear benefit to the economy.
Jeff, come on!
He's employing hundreds of people here, showing the neighborhood how the film industry works. But he says he could have gone the other way.
Just as I used my smarts to finance a film with credit cards, I could have said, hey man, I could have the biggest drug coke operation in Chicago. I could run this. But I said, no. I can make my own movies. This doesn't look that hard. I'll just take credit cards and make my own movies and get the actors and I'll produce and write and direct it myself. Now I could have used that same sense the other way and you would have been talking, we talk with Robert Townsend, extraordinary drug dealer. Hey, how y'all doing out there? I mean, same thing. I just wanted to say, they caught me this time. I made $1 billion. I was the black Michael Bilkins, but hey, I could have been that. So it's a fine line.
What do you know how to do?
Rob, steal, and kill.
Where did you get this rob, steal, and kill?
From being out there and seeing it happen. That was the only way people was making it.
At a juvenile prison in Whittier, east of Los Angeles, are kids who wound up on the other side of the line and are now a huge cost to the economy. Americans pay about $35,000 per inmate per year to maintain a prisoner. With blacks constituting half of the country's 1 million prisoners, that's $15 to $20 billion a year right there. The added cost in lost wages is an estimated $100 to $200 billion over the lifetime of these guys, since if past trends hold, fully half of them will be back in jail within 18 months.
See, when I got out, I left out with the impression that everything was going to be easy, everything was going to go my way. I was going to get out and be able to get a job, just knock on somebody's door or whatever. But see, when I got out there, reality hit me. It's like I couldn't really, it was hard for me to find a job, and eventually I gave up and resorted back to the same stuff that I came from.
For so many here, the easiest line of work was a high-paying career in drugs. Now, we spent most of the afternoon with these young men, and the more time we spent, the more clear it seemed that guys like Greg White, given different circumstances, could be a benefit to the economy instead of a cost.
Yeah, there's some soda here.
After an impromptu dinner, we tried to understand why as teenagers they dropped out of school, committed crimes, and wound up as a cost here in prison.
I felt that I needed somebody, you know, a group of peers that were going to encourage me, you know, to boost my self-esteem. Back then, you know what I'm saying? Like when they gave me my nickname. And,
What is your nickname?
My nickname was Maniac.
Maniac?
Maniac. And you know, my you know, what I was thinking about that name, meaning, you know what I'm saying, I'm just crazy, lunatic, loped out, you know, that boosted my self-esteem.
Like he said, his name, Maniac, you know what I'm saying, going out doing things to earn up to that name, doing whatever he got to do, you know, have his homies talk around, sit around and talk about him, like, yeah, you hear what Maniac did? He won't do one woman. You like, yeah, you sitting back like, yeah, you know, that's what I want. That's what I want, that reputation, and people to look up to me. That's what I want.
When this drive for reputation, headed in the wrong direction, collides with an incendiary event like the Rodney King ruling, you can get the kind of imagery that's become all too familiar.
No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace! No justice!
The immediate cost of scenes like this is obvious, but the long-term economics are far worse, according to Peter Uberoth.
You'd have to start it with a T, not a B for billion, a T for trillion. If the United States of America can't make the racial mix work, our ability to compete globally goes right down the rat hole. So the cost, I mean, it's almost not worth adding them all up because it's so disastrous.
Uberoth heads a massive project to rebuild L.A. His co-chairman is Bernard Kinsey.
In our society, we don't really have a choice, as I see it. The two fastest growing employment sectors is prison guards and security guards in this country. We spend fully $4 billion a year just in this city with prisons and police force and sheriff's force. We spend over $30,000 a year to house somebody in prison and only $5,400 to educate them. It seems to me that the whole notion of trying to beat the Japanese or the Germans or anyone with 30 to 40% of your population not even in the game is heresy. Not do that.
Kinsey, a former Xerox executive, and Uberoth, former czar of baseball in the '84 LA Olympics, are intent on turning the costs of the inner city into benefits.
So environment will come under real estate, land use, urban plan. This is going to be a big, big task force.
The task forces here will be doing everything from neighborhood organizing to luring new investment.
Paul, we're in what used to be the garden center of the former store here.
This was a Sears.
That's right. That's what these...
Roger Stangland is CEO of the Vons supermarket chain, which plans to open a dozen stores, create more than 1,000 jobs, starting on this site in Inglewood. They've already hired a black construction company to clear the site. But the problem is, most work here won't pay as well as the tens of thousands of factory jobs that have fled town in the past decade. Vons will provide a lot of low-wage service jobs, like bagging groceries, that few of us want to take, including the young men in prison, whose immediate prospects are jobs like cleaning offices or flipping the proverbial burgers.
Job as McDonald's or a janitor is not going to support you, though, not comfortably. You still going to have to struggle with that job as a janitor or at McDonald's. So therefore, we want to live comfortably, so we chose the route of selling drugs to keep money in our pockets so we won't have to struggle.
Now, there is an economic rationale for this reluctance to start at the bottom, whether you agree with it or not. It has to do with the changing shape of the American economy. Often, stories about the drug trade are illustrated by two props, the mirror and the $100 bill. We're going to use these props in a slightly different way. This is one way of depicting the economies of the past, as a triangle shape, with most people in poverty at the bottom and fewer as you move towards prosperity at the top. Now, in the 20th century, America had been moving toward equality and a more nearly diamond-shaped economy. with most jobs in the broad working middle class requiring little formal education. But America is now threatening to turn economic progress on its head and move towards an hourglass economy. With the good jobs above, many requiring more education than ever, more bad jobs below requiring less, and a vanishing middle. As a result, it's becoming an increasingly tight squeeze to move up, especially for young black males who've started at the bottom.
We seen Joe Blow down the street with a Mercedes-Benz on Gold Lorenzo's high signing with a gang of girls around him. The American dream. That's what we seen. It ain't how you get the money as long as you got it. And, you know, we see people go to school, get their little high school diploma and be slaving at McDonald's or somewhere. Like, man, I don't want that. School can, you know, put that behind somewhere.
The young men we talked to yesterday, we'd say to them, why wouldn't you take a job, or why would, when you were on the outside? They'd say, hey, I'm not going to take a low-level job. I see the BMW.
The hell with them.
What?
The hell with them. You know, if they're not going to take a low-level job, that's where you start.
That's right.
Everybody in America starts. And I hear you say take the hamburger flipping jobs out. You know what happens if you take the $5 an hour jobs away from the community? The $9 an hour jobs drop to 5.
That's right.
And the 14s drop to 9, and the whole economic base goes away.
But low wages aside, the very fact of a job is critical, according to Bernard Kinsey.
Because the notion of having a job is more important than even a paycheck, because it causes you to get up in the morning, it teaches you life skills, it teaches you interpersonal skills, it teaches you math skills, it teaches you the whole notion of work, which is a very socializing kind of process.
On a vacant lot in South Central is one of Uberoth and Kinsey's model programs, turning gang members into businessmen. In what seems like no time at all, a crew of former Crips hustles to set up shop, selling top-of-the-line sneakers at rock-bottom prices.
All the low tops will go one box up under the double top.
They go by their street names here, High T and Ray Ray. For a Crip, taking care of business used to mean challenging any blood who crossed his path.
I don't know, anything could happen. I'll pull up on them, stop, say something to them, you know, get out. It could be a fight, a killing, anything.
And this would not be a person you had any personal reason to dislike?
Because he had a different color, a different ride color, different set.
That was it?
That was it.
As in places like Bosnia, Bengal, Beirut, tribal rivalry can destroy civilization. But common effort can restore it. A 6-month truce between the Crips and the Bloods launched these ex-gang members as entrepreneurs. They've reframed their rivalry as an opportunity, capitalizing on peace with a sneaker they designed.
Red and blue stand for Bloods and Crips, man. You know, Crips are blue and red. Red is Bloods. And then we had the true symbol on the back.
Oh yeah, it says true
peace. That's right. This is me and Hot T's idea. We said, man, we want to get a shoe, man, because we know what to sell, and we know this is what the people want, man.
These guys used to be an enormous cost to the economy, as much as $1 million. High T alone served 10 years on a murder conviction. But after intensive life skills training, job training, and a $20,000 investment from a local sneaker company, Eurostar, they're becoming an economic benefit.
Top of the line, man.
High T says they can now use their marketing skills and learn some new ones, selling shoes instead of drugs.
Same skills. You got to deal with the customers. You got to get the product off but selling drugs is a little different though, because you're trying to get rid of the customer fast. You're not trying to spend the time and make the customer happy. You just want to get your money, get him his product, and get away from him.
High T and Ray Ray say they're making good money here, though they won't be specific. Our guess is upwards of $15 an hour. More certain is that instead of earning their reputation by maniacal gang exploits, they're setting a positive example for their friends.
You know, they are buddies, man. They come up and help us set up, man, and kick it with us, sometimes help sell shoes. You know, they like what we're doing, man. They respect that, man. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, we respect them for helping us and loving us, you know. That's basically what it's about.
Is this the answer? Is this the answer? I mean, is this how, if the inner city, call it what you will, poor streets are going to turn around? Is this how it's going to happen?
Jobs, man. Opportunities. That's the only way I believe it's going to turn around.
Well, Ray Ray can finally provide for his 3 kids, and High T is laughing all the way to the bank, where just a few hours ago he made his first deposit ever.
It was awesome, man. I'm carrying the money. It's my money. It's legal. I'm in a bank. I'm everything's legal. It's just, I don't know, it can't really be explained, I guess, unless you live the life that I live. Seeing my name on the City of Los Angeles tax registration certificate, IT and Ray, this alone would make you feel, you know, tremendous. It's awesome. I never had nothing like this before. I'm a 28-year-old man, and all I've been having is $1 and it's gone, $1 and it's gone. But now it's like, I can save, and it's money that I actually really work for, physically, mentally, and all that.
Now, we don't want to romanticize this story. Sales have been off at the Sneaker Mart the last few weeks, and let's face it, most new businesses fail. Moreover, training kids like this is very expensive. On the other hand, like it or not, we're all playing on the same economic team. So if we don't invest in our teammates now, what's it going to cost us later?
You can pay me now or you can pay me later means that you could invest the money in the future of these kids that are growing up, these young minds. They're not all corrupt. You know, no one is born, they're born babies. They're not born corrupt, and this one's going to be a criminal, I can tell. You know, or we don't have to invest in those same kids that could have been given a chance will come back and see you again, and it'll be under circumstances that you don't want to see them under.
The last word goes to Professor Harry Edwards, a sports sociologist who studied these issues for years.
We raid the business schools, bring in the most brilliant minds, put billions of dollars behind it to deal with Russia, but when it comes down to dealing with South Central and inner city, we want to bring in ball players. I'm saying that we must begin to look seriously at these problems, because here we're not talking about saving the Soviet Union. We're talking about Americans saving America, and that's what's at stake here, not just South Central.
Well, of course, the Russians have nuclear weapons.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're a lot more threatened by the chaos and disruption and instability and the tremendous financial cost of the situation that we have going here inside of this country than anything that anybody might muster on the outside, nuclear power or not. We're more likely to collapse from the inside than we are to be destroyed from the outside.
Civil rights activists of the 50s and 60s cannot be called cynical for asking, we have overcome what? And there are not a few people out there now saying it's worse now than it ever has been. We have more divisions today than ever before. May I ask you to begin our program, President John Silber?
Yes, to say things have not changed is to distort the facts beyond recognition. Things have changed immeasurably. There are many improvements that we should not overlook, despite the fact that much remains to be done. We should remember that in 1965, you didn't even have blacks able to attend restaurants in most cities. They couldn't even use the bathroom or the toilet in a U.S. highway. These conditions, at least, have been overcome. One thing we do have to recognize, however, is that the corrective measures that should have been taken in the middle 60s to help and support black families were not done. The provision of preschool education, Head Start opportunities for black children and for poor children generally was not done in any substantial way.
President Silber, you sit next to the first black woman to ascend to the office of mayor of a major industrial city. I speak of the District of Columbia, Mayor Sharon Pratt Kelly. To which comments you would respond how, Mayor Kelly?
Well, I guess I'd have to respond two ways. I'd say that we as African Americans have achieved against incredible odds to the extent that we didn't even get the first window of opportunity to have access to the American dream until the 1960s, and that now we have one among us who's the governor of Virginia, one among us who's chairman of the Democratic Party, several among us who are now mayors of major cities, thousands among us who occupy a major political office, but yet in 1992, the issue of race is just as real, just as divisive, just as formidable as it was when we arrived in 1619. What we've achieved has been against the odds, not because America is at peace with us.
On the occasion of having a comment of hers criticized by Governor Bill Clinton, Sister Souljah, a raptivist, a musical artist and also a political activist, found herself on the cover of Newsweek magazine. Sister Souljah, what are your thoughts as you listen in on these opening comments?
I think that there have been gains for individual people, but we as African people, as a collective, have not moved forward as we should. And most of the time, the African people that you have that are able to occupy the positions of mayors and governors do not occupy it forcefully and forthrightly for the collective of African people in this country. And as a result, what you have is millions of young African and Latino children and youth who are in a state of total chaos, who don't have skills and don't have any idea how they're going to develop their skills, and are estranged from even the adults in their own race because of the problem of not dealing with white racism and the real impact that it has on our lives.
Alan Keyes spoke at the Republican convention this year. You are a candidate, sir, for the United States Senate from Maryland, where you oppose incumbent Democratic Senator Barbara Mikulski, who, yes, was invited to appear on our panel and declined. Increasing numbers of black Americans, including you, Dr. Keyes, have stood to say that too many minority people in this country have internalized the process of the dole, of the handout. Woe is me, I'm black and therefore I can do nothing. I received a terrible education in a racist society. Where is my handout? Is that a fair characterization of your feeling about what has happened to the spirit and the soul of some minority people in this country?
Well, I would say what has happened, because it's not like lightning striking from above. I would have to say what has been done. You know, this was done. You had programs where you wrote the rules and regulations in such a way as to discourage work, to break up families, to actually penalize people who were trying to help themselves. So don't tell me that this suddenly happened to folks. It was done to folks. And now we're going to have to make some active efforts to undo it. And I'm not one of those folks who's going to say there was a big conspiracy to destroy people, but it does seem to me that you couldn't have thought of a better conspiracy to destroy black leadership, the black community, black institutions, than what posed as this effort in the bureaucratic welfare state to help people. And so I think we need to think it through, try to undo its damage, which is going to take conscious use of the same power that helped to produce that damage, and then concentrate on allowing people to have the power to shape their own destiny.
Dhoruba Bin Wahad, you served 19 years for attempted murder of 2 policemen, a judgment that was overturned more recently on the basis of an unfair trial and the withholding of information. Let me ask you, Dhoruba Bin Wahad, how you feel what jumped out at you on that piece?
When we look at these young men on the screen here, one of the young brothers said, you know, what do you know how to do? He said, rob, steal, and kill. What did Columbus know how to do when he came here? Rob the native people of their land, kill them, and exploit them. What did they know how to do? What is in the best tradition of capitalism in this society? Burning, loot, rape, and pillage. This is something that is as integral to the United States as breathing. And the problem with race in this country is that white people in this country do not want to confront their own history and live up to the consequences of that history. And when you don't confront the truth will ultimately destroy you.
Does Mr. Wahad make you squirm at all, Richard Nathan, director of the Nelson Rockefeller Institute of Government of the State University of Albany of New York? You were an original member of the Kerner Commission. How do you respond to the angry observations of Mr. Bin Wahad?
Actually, I was the research director of the commission, and looking back, it's now 25 years. I think there's good news and there's bad news. We've talked a little bit about the good news. The bad news, and I agree with Mr. Wahad, is that in the inner cities, what he's talking about is deepening violence. The inner city conditions, I think, are worsening. But the flip side of that is that there are new neighborhoods, middle class, black neighborhoods in lots of cities that are fighting hard to stave off the effects of inner city problems and violence. And there's a large increase in lots of big cities in suburban African-American neighborhoods that are actually, in many cases, quite well off. Part of the bad news agenda that worries me is that the mood is worsening. There's a backlash, there's a deeper feeling about racism in the black community, and there's a hardening attitude, I think, in the white community. So it's a worrisome time, I grant you that.
But you know, Phil, I think that he just did exactly what Dhoruba brought up, which is that when we deal with the issue of white racism, white people don't deal with the fact that they are the ones who are sicker than anybody else in this particular issue, which is why when you deal with the question of race, you cannot deal with what's wrong with these African people. See, the thing that happened in South Central started with a malady in the justice system, where white people could not see white men who had did something against black men and penalize them for what everybody in this country knows that they did. So the problem of white racism is that we don't look in depth and do these little documentaries on white people and what's wrong with them.
I like to add to that. The professor, the president, John Silber, said that one of the problems with the programs of the 60s was that they did not provide corrective measures to help the black family. We need to understand that when black people were brought here to the United States, they were brought here as an act of war. They were kidnapped here, and the destruction of the black family and the creation of a slave mentality was an integral part of the development of this nation state. So there has never been an interest in the black family, and that's reflected today. But even more, every city in which we have aspired to so-called political power. In Newark, black males are being murdered by the Newark Police Department under the guise they're robbing cars. When we look at New York City, the police riot in the streets. When we look at LA, there was a riot in the streets. All of these cities have black mayors. Yes. So we have to begin to understand that moving black people up the economic ladder does not necessarily mean that black people on the bottom of the economic ladder are going to be empowered, because there are black people who identify with the system so much that they are self-hating Negroes.
Mr. Bin Wahad, you seem to be going kaboom to the entire white community. Do we have from you a spirit of belief that there really are out there in America white folks who do not suffer from the pathology that Sister Souljah reminds us does exist in this country?
But why is that the question? In other words, it's the same as when you're dealing with the issue in South Africa. People say, well, if black people get in control of that government, what will they do with the white people who are living there? Why is that the question? Can we refocus the question as to how we're going to correct?
Let me have a moment. Let me have a moment to defend my question. Okay. If you believe that all people who are white are interested in pillaging, reminding us, as you painfully do, of our own history.
No, that's a mischaracterization. That's a mischaracterization, and first of all, it's the mischaracterization because the Constitution was established by white males with property. It said all men are created equal, right, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It didn't say women were created equal with men, and the Bill of Rights was attached to the Constitution because people without property had no rights. So I did not say that all white people are interested in burning and looting and pillaging. I am saying that the ideals that established this country were based on burning, looting, and pillaging people's land.
Accept your point, and you concede to us that in contemporary society, we do have honorable people of all colors who have as much of an interest in the salvation of their babies as...
But the problem with that, Phil, is that the people of good intentions in the white community are the minority. They do not stand on principle, and they do not struggle against their own racism and white skin privilege. See, the problem is this. It's like men who say, I understand how you feel as a woman being subjected to sexist behavior.
They can't possibly.
Not without interacting with women and empowering them.
Bill, the problem, though, I think with this whole analysis, as I see it, we're talking, and I have great respect for the Constitution, but let's be frank, it was not based upon an idealistic view of human beings. Dhoruba doesn't realize that I think that what he's saying is a description of not white people, but all people, was in fact the foundation of America's political philosophy. People are greedy, give them a chance, they'll beat you up. Give them a chance, they'll kill you, rape you,
that's
rob
not what
you.
Dhoruba is saying.
That was exactly, if I may say so, the view of human beings, not just white human beings, but most human beings.
Have we moved
But our
somewhat
founders-
off this animalistic,
No.
primitive?
The point is, however, that the point that I think I hear at least, of what Sister Souljah says and others say, has less to do, we talk about all this economic redistribution and so forth. Let's talk about the basic issue of politics. The basic issue of politics is power. If you have power over me, you're going to abuse it. If I have no power to resist you, then I'm going to be abused. And I don't care what's in your heart. I don't want to know what's in your heart half the time. I want to know whether there's a weapon in your hand and whether I have the means to defend myself against it. Could be economic, could be social, could be political, could be physical, but I've got to be able to defend myself because I can't trust you. And that's an American statement. That is not a statement of some idealism.
There is no virtue in the human soul to be found anywhere?
That's not the point. The point is that if you give people power over you and you can't defend yourself against them, our founders said they will abuse you. And the world, if I don't mind my saying so, from a black person's point of view, I don't have to prove to you that somebody's out to get me. There are 400 years of history in this country that people are out to get me, and they got me more than half the time. I don't have to prove that to anybody.
Jonathan Kozol, whose seminal book, Death at an Early Age, was a personal account of his own experience of teaching 4th grade in the community of Roxbury, the minority community within the city of Boston. Mr. Kozol, you've been patient, sir. What are your thoughts as you listen in on our dialogue?
Well, I didn't think I'd ever agree with Alan Keyes on anything, but I sure agree with what he just said. I started teaching, as you know, in a segregated school in the mid-'60s. Today, inner-city schools everywhere are more segregated and less equal than they were at the time I set out as a teacher. Inner-city kids I see all over the country are in squalid, ugly, filthy, overcrowded buildings in which not one of us would willingly spend 1 hour. Their lives are more miserable today than they were when I began. By any kind of statistics, I won't drown you in statistics, but there's one which is so devastating, I have to cite it here. As you know, Phil, tracking has come back into schools again. It's become a sort of fashionable way of segregating kids within a single school. Black children, statistically, are 3 times as likely to be tracked into so-called special classes for the retarded as white children, but only half as likely to be put into gifted programs. That is an intolerable statistic in a democracy. And anybody who looks at that and all the other statistics, the fact that black infant mortality is twice that of white children, anyone who looks at those kinds of statistics, or a recent news event, black Haitians being brutally excluded from this country while white Europeans are welcomed at New York International Airport. Anyone who looks at that knows in their heart that racism remains the central moral agony of this society.
Yeah. So my pleading to Mr. Bin Wahad and to Dr. Keyes in the white liberal tradition of, gee, you don't totally dislike us, do you, is a rather empty
I'll
kind
tell
of...
you why I think it is, Phil, because not to criticize you, naturally I'd like to feel, I'm a nice guy, I hope black people will like me, but that's wasted energy. The issue isn't whether they like you and me or not. The issue is whether they have an even shot in this society, and they can't afford to worry about our injured feelings.
Yes,
And
I
they
ask for
shouldn't
only
waste
one
time.
moment to defend the question. If the anger is that overwhelming, and the evidence supported by your scholarship makes clear their positions, then we have to wonder whether we should even waste any more energy with this ideal of integration and living together and cooperating. I ask you not because I'm an insecure person who wants to be loved. I have children who must live in the society.
Dr. Edwards is the one who spoke eloquently to the point, and that is America herself. America herself will not survive in the 21st century unless she comes to tap into the diversity that is hers and stop pursuing this kind of divisive policy. This is more of a threat to the future of America than anything ever posed by the old USSR. We will explode from within unless we all understand we have a stake in this system. And that's the compelling issue, not whether we like each other, not whether we love each other, not whether it ever started out right, not whether we should be angry with anybody. We won't survive unless we understand we're in it together.
Appreciate very much your comments. Mayor Kelly, and I promise I shall not, for the rest of the program, ask any member of this audience or panel whether they like me. Please welcome Anna Deavere Smith is the performing artist who is responsible for a much-discussed, much-heralded one-woman show titled Fires in the Mirror. You wanted to say, Miss Smith.
Well, I wanted to say something about the fact of who's together here in this issue of race. And it's kind of startling to me that we are looking at the issue of race still in black and white, especially since we watched these fires of Los Angeles burn, and it's clear that the story is much more complex than black and white. There are Latinos involved in the story. There are Asian Americans who were taking matters to themselves and standing on roofs with their own guns. So that the dialogue that we had before we decide whether we like white people or not, I think we have to begin to develop strategies and techniques for negotiating our differences over a very broad canvas. And this is going to mean the life and death of many of us. I've worked in the New York City public schools and seen the speed and dispatch with which a naughty boy quickly becomes a retarded boy. It's simply a matter of taking him out of the class on the wrong day and putting him in another class.
What we're talking about here is very clear. If you look at Latin America today, in every society in Latin America, and Latin America is essentially a conglomeration of European settler states. The conquistadores went in there and did the same thing that the English did here and everything, right? When we look at the compositions of these societies, we see that at the top are light-skinned descendants of conquistadores, and at the bottom are native people and black descendants of Africans. White skin privilege is a European ideal and concept that was exported with their economic system, their religious philosophy, and it was exported and imposed on people of color. So when we talk about Latinos, let's understand what we're saying here. We're talking about Latinos who, for the most part, have African blood in them, and they have internalized racism just like everybody else. When we look at Asian Americans, many of the Asians that came here initially came to work the railroads. They were treated like dogs. They were treated like dirt. But when we see a lot of Asians that come to the United States today, one of the first words they learn in their lexicon, one of the first things that they learn is nigger. The United States' major contradiction around the issue of race is white-skinned male privilege. And if we don't attack that, if we don't analyze that, if we don't begin to deal with that, then we got a problem. And I totally disagree with the mayor of Washington, because I do not have a stake in saving a racist nation. I do not have a stake in maintaining American hegemony over people of color around the world. I do not have an interest in maintaining this system that causes the miseries of billions of people one more moment.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to walk away from our investment in this country and the suffering that we've had in this country since 1619. We gave this country her culture. We gave this country her music. We gave this country her margin of profit with the agricultural revolution, though we never got our 40 acres and a mule. I'll be doggone if I'm walking away from 4 centuries of investment in this country. We, too, are entitled to a piece of the rock. I don't care how wrong America was.
May I call this audience, may I please, we must move on. And in addition to our panelists, we've invited 3 distinguished observers to give their widely differing perspectives on where we go from here. They are Time magazine correspondent Sylvester Monroe, journalist and businessman Tony Brown, and Princeton professor Cornel West. Gentlemen, we do thank you for joining us. Let's begin with Mr. Monroe and the case for government assistance.
From a distance, Chicago fairly shimmers with the promise of opportunity and prosperity. And for many over the years, the city has delivered on that promise. Up close, though, for one population in particular, the quest for a better life has all too often ended here, in a burnt-out landscape of mean streets and broken dreams. The legacy of America's most intractable problem, race.
My family arrived here in the early 50s, part of a great migration of Southern blacks who came north in search of a better life. In those days, Chicago was still the promised land, even for black people. There were jobs, mostly blue-collar, and there were social services to help get started. Today, the jobs have mostly left town, and the social services have been cut back or cut out completely.
There's no money appropriated for recreational facilities, playgrounds, youth centers. All that is non-existent now. The only thing that people do around here is smoke cola 24 hours a day, and that's about it. That's the only thing you can do around here.
What about these little kids? I talked to these little kids. I mean, when we were little kids, we had
In the early
playground
60s,
here,
Norris
we had,
Thorne was my neighbor at the Robert Taylor homes, a 2.5-mile stretch of high-rise buildings that make up the largest public housing project in the country. Today, it is also one of the grimmest. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, the Taylor homes were launched with great expectations.
It represents the future of a great city.
But behind Mayor Daley's public rhetoric, the city's white power structure had a very different agenda, namely the containment and de facto segregation of blacks on Chicago's south and west sides.
Chicago was consciously and malevolently and viciously divided racially under the first Mayor Richard Daley, and even before him by realtors and bankers.
Author and educator Jonathan Kozol.
It was done most dramatically by putting an expressway in a perfect location where it would constitute a wall between black and white communities, and then putting only black housing on the south side of that highway. That highway is still there today. That black housing is still there today. Those black projects are still there today. That hasn't changed. There is nothing past about past discrimination in America.
Today, the Taylor homes warehouse 19,000 people, all of them black, all of them poor, and virtually all of them stuck here for good. Imprisoned by a deliberate policy of isolation and abandonment, which has turned places like this into the American equivalent of Soweto.
Poor blacks are oftentimes bunched together in housing, in academic institutions.
Carl Bell is a psychiatrist and former Chicago gang member.
While poor whites, because there are less restrictions on their mobility, can be living next door to middle-class families or to wealthier families, so that they have more access, even though they're equally as poor.
Nowhere is the damage wrought by racial discrimination more evident or more painful than in the schools. When I walked these halls 25 years ago, public education offered black people, even the poorest, a way up and out of the ghetto. And many made it as doctors, lawyers, teachers, and other professionals. Today, my old school, once the anchor of this community, is down to 1/4 of its former enrollment and may well be forced to shut its doors altogether.
Although the school is not what it was back in the 60s, it certainly does do a lot for this community. And it'd be most unfortunate if it closed.
Leroy Lovelace, my high school English teacher, was the man who first inspired me to become a writer. More importantly, he helped me turn that dream into reality.
Lady Macbeth, I know you know something about Lady Macbeth.
Today, he's still in the trenches, but the support is no longer there.
For example, you all had 4-H club to reinforce, what went on in school and that sort of thing, to get you involved, keep you involved. And all those positive things, which we like those sort of things today. We just don't have the funds for it.
Who does the Congress represent? The people. And who has this government been established for? The people.
However discouraging the gap between Phillips' past and present, it is nothing compared to the gulf that today separates nearly all inner-city schools, Phillips included, from their suburban counterparts.
Well, the numbers are just devastating. New York City, on a typical day, spends exactly half as much per pupil as the richest suburban school districts outside New York are spending. And that's just inexcusable and unjustifiable in a democracy. That's as savage as anything could be.
Kozol paints a grim picture of what happens when a society is unwilling to guarantee all its children a quality education.
I think, in a way, the most tragic years for African-American kids are the years from 4th grade to 6th grade. Those are the years in which the dream dies. the ugliness and squalor of the inner city schools, which are often physically repellent places, is compounded by the sense of racial isolation, the sense literally of being in a repository for society's untouchables. And the kids sense this.
He's real smart, you know, top, he's ranked.
In the end, that misery tests even the most highly motivated, like Kerry Wingo, another Lovelace student. A senior at Phillips, Kerry's hoping for a college scholarship to get him out.
Do you ever get depressed? You know, when you walk here and you see burnt out stuff like this, nothing in the community. I mean, this is where you live, where you go to school?
Yeah, lots, because especially if you look at this, all the abandoned buildings and you see all the homeless people, and you look around, you see, man, like, where's the community centers? Where the kids going to play on a cold day, you know?
That this community needs outside help is painfully evident. Less obvious, but just as compelling, is another argument for assistance. Black inner-city neighborhoods like this one are owed that help. While no single group can or would claim a monopoly on suffering, the United States has a special debt to its black citizens, incurred in slavery and compounded over 300 years of injustice and discrimination. Sadly, that debt is still unpaid.
I think the fact is that African Americans came to this country under very different circumstances, specifically slavery, as compared to other ethnic groups. And as a result of being put in bondage, there are disadvantages that we have never been compensated for.
You know, if you ask me, I don't see why each and every person can go to college, you know. I mean,
For every successful African American, self-help and personal responsibility have always been a part of the equation. And that will be as true for a kid like Kerry Wingo as it was for me.
I don't see why there's no reason no one can go to college.
But here's the point. If any of this coming generation manage somehow to make it out of here, they'll do so over obstacles their white suburban counterparts could hardly even imagine. As long as those obstacles remain, Black Americans will continue to have a special moral claim that only government can redress.
So long as there are ghetto schools, there will be ghetto desperation, ghetto pathology, ghetto rage, because a ghetto is itself a diseased institution. It breeds rage, it breeds pathology, it breeds self-destruction. This is not going to be a fashionable suggestion. I'd like to see this nation find the courage to reopen the agenda of racial isolation.
We have just reviewed Sylvester Monroe's review of his own return to the school of his youth. Is there anything you wanted to add to what you've said? I might ask you about your own personal feelings as you walked past those graffiti-covered walls.
Well, what's interesting about going back there, what's painful about going back there, is people talk about these communities and how people ought to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. They ought to do that. That was a community that regularly, routinely produced successful members of society when it had the support necessary to do that. And it pains me to hear people talk about a welfare state, people who want a handout. What communities like this, what black people have always asked for, is not a handout. They are citizens of this country. What they're asking for is equal access to opportunity, to education. Government has a role, and no one is saying that government can solve all the problems there. And part of that role is to provide a quality of education that means something. That school used to have that.
Why is it that government, that the Lyndon Johnson era, which is the time I would assume you were a student at that school?
That's right.
Well, what's different then? Why can't it work now?
Well, one of the things I think that when I was a student in the Chicago public school system, never one day in the 10 years that I was a student in the Chicago public schools did I miss a day of school because of a teacher strike or because there was not enough money to keep the schools open. Perhaps that was because the Chicago public school systems were then a majority white system. The Chicago public school system today is majority minority. And so now we can't find the money anymore.
So white power fled then. or at least turned its back on
It has turned
this
its back.
establishment.
It has turned its back. And so at the question that Paul Solomon asked at the top of this piece, why should people, and people will say to you, well, my kids don't go to that school. I don't live in that community. What does that have to do with me? It has everything to do with you. This is a democracy. We pay taxes to distribution of wealth. Shared wealth in this country is one of the foundations of this country. If we don't educate those children, we can't build enough prisons. We can't rebuild LA enough times. Everyone, I mean, I understand why this gentleman feels he doesn't have a stake in this society, but everybody will pay if we don't.
How would Mr. Kozol respond to Mr. Monroe's observation, which suggests that when the white man goes, so does the power?
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with him. In Chicago, nothing he said was overstated. A couple months ago, the Chicago school system, abandoned by white people, not just white children, but white business, everyone, had to start rationing toilet paper. Children now have to bring it from home. It's absolute apartheid today in Chicago.
The issue is more than just money. It's also an issue of control and curriculum, and what type of African adults are you trying to produce within that school system. I was in the Intelligent and Gifted Children's program. I went to Cornell University Preparatory. I was on welfare, Head Start, free lunch, free breakfast, forced busing for integration. Every single government program ever created, I have been
Here you are on the cover of
participating in.
Newsweek magazine. It must have worked.
That's not the point, because I talked about white people. That was why I was on the cover. They were not celebrating my academic victories.
Your point is made.
Right. So my point becomes, Phil, that how you design those programs. In all of the programs that I attended, all of the education that I had, college, public, and otherwise, nobody ever told me that I was an African woman. Nobody ever told me what the history of African people were. Nobody ever told me that America is business, and without business you will have nothing and be nothing. And nobody ever told me how to organize business so that I would be able to develop institutions in my own community. So now the sincerity of all of the programs and all of the education has to be questioned, indicted, and convicted, because the bottom line is that America is not and has never tried to produce African adults who are functional, self-sufficient, who understand their politics, their economics, and their relationship to the world politics and the world economics.
America's never going to understand that as some abstraction. Communities understand that. You must give communities the power and the control, and finally address the whole point. You can't just pour money into a school. You've got to build up in the community the economic base to sustain the school. You can't deal with these problems in isolation and say, I'll have a good school in a neighborhood with no economic base and no jobs and no businesses. You want decent schools, you've got to develop the communities in which those schools exist so that you have an economic base to support them. You've got to develop the power politically so that the community will be able to control that environment in which the school exists and meet the needs, culturally, value-wise, otherwise, that community reflects. And that means that you've got to have power in the hands of that community as a whole. Not in the hands of education bureaucrats, not in the hands of social bureaucrats, but in the hands of the people of the community themselves.
There is a gentleman in our room who believes he has an answer to your very optimistic call for jobs and empowerment. The issue is race. We'll continue following this brief break for your public television station.
Funding for The Issue is Race is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you. Additional funding is provided by the Boston Foundation. This is PBS.
Our program, The Issue is Race, continues. Let us go now to the second of our three essays. Here is Tony Brown making the case for black self-reliance.
It is my pleasure to give you
Tony Brown.
The message that I give today, self-help, basically, love yourself, be proud of who you are, and any proud person will be productive. That's the basic fundamental theme.
If there was ever a time when America needed to stop and reconsider itself, it is now. And I would like to say to those of us who are of African descent that nobody can do for us what we refuse to do for ourselves.
I was born and raised in Charleston, West Virginia during the era of segregation. But we were not raised the way poor people in that status today would be raised, and that is they would be raised to A, learn they're poor, B, they're black and they can't make it. I learned that if I worked hard, became competitive, was a fairly decent person, I could have what I want in life. And that's the only philosophy in life I've ever known.
Tony Brown Productions, good afternoon.
Tony Brown Productions today primarily consists of the television series.
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you by Pepsi and its bottlers.
A magazine we publish each year. I write a syndicated column in 130 black weekly newspapers. And I make about 50 to 60 speeches a year to various groups.
Busing is the dumbest idea anybody has ever had. To have the notion that you're going to get this little African up really early in the morning, put him or her on a yellow bus, ship them across town to this good white neighborhood, and he'll learn to read, write, and count. Well, let me tell you what's really dumb about busing. What's really dumb about busing is that only 16% of Anglos finish college. 46% of Asian Americans finish college. So if you want to bust Tony Brown, you bust me to Chinatown. We had a chance, ladies and gentlemen, right after the civil rights struggle, but after we won the right to be included in all of society's institutions, the enemies of the black community, mostly the white liberals and their Negro allies, designed a movement called integration. What happened to us under the guise of integration was that we lost all of our institutions, with the exception of the black church, and gained nothing.
About 20 years ago, when I first started giving this speech, many of the middle-class blacks abhorred what I said, and many of them today are still around. They now pay me obscene honoraria to say to them what they walked out on me when I was saying to them 20 years ago. Now when I travel around the country, I see middle-class blacks and poor blacks finally coming together around the concept of self-help, because it is very apparent that there is no white cavalry on its way to save the black neighborhoods. A perfect example is a church-sponsored event I recently spoke at in Louisville, Kentucky.
Racism isn't fair. No, it is not. But ladies and gentlemen, the elevator is broke. You got to take the stairs. This is a competitive society. This is a society, ladies and gentlemen, that if you're upset with the Koreans because they work 16 hours a day and maintain their family unit and save money and loan money to one another and make one another successful, if you're angry with them, you're not going to stop them by burning them out. You're not going to stop them by hating them. What you need to do is to go right next door, take that old dirty storefront, make it clean, build it up, I'll buy from you. Make your school so good, other folks will go to court and sue you to come to sit next to you. Build up your neighborhood the way St. Stephen's is building up this neighborhood.
St. Stephen's sits in the poorest neighborhood of Louisville. What are they doing? They're buying up condemned and abandoned buildings, fixing them up, naming them after black leaders they admire. They run a big daycare operation so parents can go to work with their minds at ease. They've got a program for young black men where they become computer tutors. So it helps these young men, and it makes the children computer literate, getting them ready for the future, cutting leading-edge occupations. So they've created dozens of jobs, and out back, they're building a huge new auditorium, creating even more jobs, and without a penny of government money. Black people are not poor. It is an absolute myth that any group of people can earn $300 billion, equal to the gross national product of the 14th richest nation in the world, and call themselves poor. We behave poorly. We need to teach our dollars some sense. We need to spend a larger percentage of our money in our own communities, as every other ethnic and racial group does, which is why I call my economic development programs Buy Freedom. And the way it works is this. We say, call this 900 number. Listen to the directory.
The Talking Yellow Pages connect callers with businesses, professionals, churches, and organizations for information and discounts.
Now, the average call will cost you $3. $1 will go to the phone company, $1 will go to the Buy Freedom Network, and $1 will go to the business you call up.
The bottom line is more money, more money, more money, and it never stops.
Barbara Ann Teer's National Black Theater in Harlem, we're working with very closely because she has a very serious problem.
Every day the clock is ticking at about $600 a day, and we're now up to 300,000 additional new dollars to successfully close the project and keep it from going back into the hands of the lenders, because they are putting on us such heavy requirements.
How much money have you already invested?
$10 million.
You have put?
Yes, I have.
Over
I
a period.
have raised. It's a gorgeous building. Now, the beautiful thing about it is I went to Nigeria and brought back 5 new sacred artists, so the interior is all handmade, telling a new story about who African people are. And on the outside, it has cement relief art. It's very beautiful. And at the top of the building, there will be 5 13-foot statues of our African ancestors that are witnessing the business corridor of 125th Street. 7% of the buildings of the property on this business corridor from 125th Street, the east side, all the way to the west side, only 7% of these buildings are owned by people of African descent.
Now, if you could imagine going into Chinatown and saying only 7% of the businesses are owned, buildings are owned by Chinese, you couldn't believe it.
You have to own your own space, because if you don't, you can get put out in the streets. So, when we own the block, you see, all of our tenants support each other so that we have a wonderful example of economic empowerment. But the lenders, they don't want to hear my philosophy. They just want to know about the numbers, you know.
It's hard. It's hard, A, getting the concept over that we've got to recycle our money. That's hard. I went to I won't name the National Black Organization. I spoke there this summer. They had an orchestra at one of the programs, about 85 members of the orchestra, strings and everything, had a big singer. Not one member of that orchestra was black. And I don't think they see any contradiction in what they're doing. They're in a white hotel, they're spending millions of dollars, even they have an all-white orchestra. And God knows if blacks can do anything, we can certainly play music.
This is my final point. December the 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks would not surrender her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. When Rosa Parks sat down, we stood up all over America with a new sense of consciousness. And what did we learn on December the 1st, 1955? We learned that there had been plenty of room in the front of the bus all along. All we ever had to do was to get up and move.
Well, Tony Brown, for a talk show host, you've been unusually well behaved throughout this program, and I thank you for your patience. Do I sound like a white racist to say, see what I mean? You can pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. Does that make you nervous if I say something like that?
No, but the context would make me nervous if you were suggesting, and you're not, that all blacks had to do was to go to work, and if they worked as hard as whites, we could make it. But that's not the context in which you're saying it. The context in which you're saying it is that we are looking at a group of people, 30 million people, who this year will earn $300 billion, equal to the 14th richest nation in the world. We're 12% of the population. We buy 18% of the orange juice, 20% of the rice, 26% of Cadillac cars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have 350 black organizations, middle-class blacks, 1 million of which go to white hotels each summer. They spend $16 billion discussing white racism and black poverty. Now, there's no way in the world that white people can free black people, because freedom is not white people's to give. 2, white people, as I said in the piece, cannot do for us what we refuse to do for ourselves. 3, the key to this equation is the behavior of the black middle class. The key to this is not understanding whether or not whites like blacks or blacks like whites. I frankly have no interest in that at all. I have no interest in managed society. I'm not interested in having to sit next to people because they're white. I'm interested in being equal, and the only way you're equal is to have power. Alan Keyes said the most cogent thing said here tonight, and that is we are talking about power, not whether or not white people have been fair, not whether they're nice people, not whether or not black people are good or bad, but whether or not you as a community of people have the instruments of defense and in some cases of aggression to protect your turf and or your interests. You can't have 30 million people handing over to another people 100% of their resources and blaming them for 100% of their problems. That is not intelligent. So what we need to do in the black community is A, decide to be competitive. And the only way we're going to be competitive is to use our resources. And the final thing I'd like to say is this. The primary resource we have as a people is not our money. It's what we know. And what you know is called human capital. And the fleet of human capital from the black community has been enormous in the name of integration. We've lost our brains to the white community, and nobody is there for the intergenerational transfer of information from middle-class people to poor people, so we now have what we call so-called underclass people.
But if what you know is that critically important, and I don't know anybody who will argue it, how is it possible, in the light of Mr. Kozol's nightmarish and brutally honest and well-researched review of the horror story of public education, especially in the inner cities, for black children to know anything?
White power structure and the white community in America are out of options. They can no longer afford racism, and they can no longer afford school systems that don't work for this following reason. In 8 years, over 50% of the population workforce will be female and non-white. In 30 years, this will be a majority numerically non-white nation. If we do not train women and non-whites to go into the workforce for high-tech skill jobs in the next 8 years, none of us in this room is going to have a job at all. So Mr. Kozol, there's another dimension to what he is saying, and I'm sure he's more than aware of it, and that is, it is not black schools that have failed. The American school system has failed. It is not the ones who drop out that are the problem. The ones who graduate are the problem. We do not have a school system that does anything for post-secondary education, and we don't have a school system that does anything for the bottom 50%, which is why Germany and Japan are beating our brains out.
Regardless of the color of the student.
Regardless. Now, when you get to blacks, we cannot leave out of this equation the black middle class. And we cannot leave out of this equation, no matter what the government does, and the government should do something. We cannot leave out the obligation of the black middle class to transfer its wealth, primary wealth, which is human capital or information, to those in our community who don't have it.
May I ask you're a capitalist with a...
I am not a capitalist, and you said that before. I'm not interested in proving capitalism. I'm interested in using a free market system to alleviate the problems in the black community.
Is capitalist a bad word?
Well, if the way you're using it is though I am trying to prove that this system is better than that system.
No,
I'm not into ideology. You can call me anything you want.
You're a businessman who takes full advantage of the free market opportunities. Let me put it that way.
I'm trying to pay my rent and keep the phone
Very
ringing.
good.
Now, I don't know what you call that. Whatever you call
All
that,
right.
that's what I do. Now, okay, so I am simply interested in this. There are 30 million of us. We earn $300 billion. We spend 6.6% of our money with one another, 95% with other people. I'm simply interested in creating structures so we can transfer that money back, and most of all, not to any black person in this room, but to poor black people, because the difference in the achievement of our community
will not come from middle-class blacks like us who have done so well under affirmative action. Poor blacks didn't get a nickel. They're the ones who are hurting, which is why the black community is in such dire difficulty.
Yes. We're leaving out a lot of things in this story. There are hard-working, good people working in community development corporations, and your emphasis, I like the piece that Tony did, your emphasis on middle-class African-American neighborhoods and the growth of these neighborhoods in cities and in suburbs is something that mustn't be left out of this picture. Yes. Otherwise, people aren't going to try.
Your point is made at a time when the middle class is identified with the NAACP, the Urban League, and the traditional We Shall Overcome civil rights leaders of the 50s and 60s that have been all but abandoned and ignored by younger people, Sister Souljah included.
I think that the dice are loaded, and that's what's left out of Mr. Brown's piece. See, there was a period of time in this country after Reconstruction where African people owned a lot of land, owned a lot of businesses, and did a lot of things. But what happened was the American government, the Ku Klux Klans, and other organizations organized in smashing that effort. So it's not that we haven't tried to own lands and have not organized businesses. It's that if you are African in America, or in Latin America, or in the Caribbean, or in the continent, you will be hunted no matter what you do, because they do not want us to survive and become self-sufficient. And you can say no, but you haven't lived this life. You haven't lived this life.
Mayor Kelly's entitled.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of reason for a lot of our anger, given our history in this country that persists even in 1992. No question about it. But the issue becomes, how do you harness that anger? Do we sit up here and talk about our history, or do we harness that anger to become an empowered community?
You do both.
Now, let me just finish. There's some of us who are struggling right now to empower our communities through educational systems and a whole host of things, trying to shift some capital in the hands of our own community so that when you produce something creative, that the people who have control over the distribution rights are African Americans as against other type of Americans, and that when we go out in this global marketplace, we will be a force with which to be reckoned. We seem to forget, however, that in the midst of all of this, there is a shift that is occurring throughout this whole globe. It isn't just the plight of those of us who are African Americans. Our plight is exacerbated, but we're in a global market. We're dealing with people from all over the world where a market can be taken over overnight by new developing nations. We need to have a better educational system. America's educational system is in a sorry condition, and the worst form of capitalism was perpetuated, espoused in the last decade by a man named Ronald Reagan with, are you better off today? Walked away from research and development, walked away from education, walked away from savings, walked away from the capacity for capital formation. The worst form of capitalism was symbolized in the last decade, and that's why we're paying a handsome price. Now, we can sit up and get angry, we can sit up and talk about it, but the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I say, let's start doing something about it now and empower our own community and stop pointing the finger at one another.
I have a question for Mr. Brown, actually, and that is, if Rosa Parks taught us that we could sit in the front of the bus, what do you think we learned in April 1992 from the Rodney King verdict?
I think we learned that if we don't have our own economic base, if we're not educated as a people, we will always be victimized by whomever.
But what can we do? I mean, we learned what we could do from the Rosa...
wouldn't have gotten beaten?
That ain't what we learned.
Is that what you're telling me?
What we learned was that when the police brutalized Rodney King, when they murdered Rodney, when they murder black people, when the police power in this society manipulates justice in the criminal justice system, we learned that they're doing their job. Their job is to contain and intimidate and terrorize black people. And this system want to know what we should do? We have to build an independent black political party to take care of our own interests and coalesce with those groups and organizations that share our interests and understand that we have black enemies of black people in our community based on the notion that they could perpetuate a system of exploitation.
I'm sure we need ways to defend ourselves, and an independent black political movement would be an excellent way to do it. But you can't get blacks out of the Democratic Party,
And you can't get them to use their vote strategically.
Don't tell me you can't.
They hate Republicans and they love Democrats.
Jesse
Democrats
Jackson
love
is
poor
getting them
people
out
so
of the
well, they
Democratic
keep
Party.
them poor. So
Jesse
we don't
Jackson
have
is getting them out of the Democratic Party.
we don't have a political instrument of power. We are out of the two-way political process altogether, taken for granted by one party and ignored by the other. He has articulated one instrument of power. An economic base is an instrument of power. An educated population is an instrument of power. Why do you think the Asians do so well in this country? They are very well educated. The people in the Pacific Rim, they're Confucian. Their very culture teaches them to stick together, work hard, go to school, stable families. This is why they succeed. We have a consciousness now called civil rights. We won the civil rights battle. We must develop a new consciousness of freedom, which means we're not interested in sitting next to or being with. We're interested in being equal to, which will give us the right to be with or sit next to whomever we want.
You have to start that process where it matters most. If you talk about what Rodney King taught me was that if the community doesn't control the police, nobody else is going to. And that you have got to put into the hands of the community the power to have a police force patrolling their streets that answers to them, not to some bureaucracy somewhere that isn't controlled by them. And that means economic development has to go hand in hand with the reclaiming of political power at the grassroots. Control your streets, control your police, control your judiciary. And this is not a new idea, by the way. America was supposed to be this way. The small towns that people idealize were basically neighborhoods controlled by the people who live in them. And our neighborhoods are no longer controlled by the people who live in them. And so most institutions in those neighborhoods, economic, political, and otherwise, are out of control.
In the immediate aftermath of Mr. Bin Wahad's call for a third political party for African Americans, I am compelled to ask Dr. Alan Keyes, Republican candidate for the Senate from the state of Maryland, how the Republican Party, of which you are a member and at whose convention you spoke, does not enjoy the support of 10% of African Americans. You spoke from the same platform as Patrick Buchanan, who called on the delegates to take back our culture. You work for a man who was dragged kicking and screaming into the signing of a Civil Rights Act.
Work for? Who do I work for?
Do you not, in a sense, work for George Bush?
Absolutely not.
Did you not?
I'm an independent politician.
Did you
I
not
have to
extol?
make my own army
Did
these
you
days.
not extol George Bush's passage of signing of the Civil Rights Act and the Act for the Disabled during his administration? And does it embarrass you at all to be surrounded by the white Christians who would call for?
Oh, excuse me. It doesn't embarrass me to pursue the power that is needed to transform the society by any means necessary. People have transformed that phrase to mean violence and all this. It doesn't mean that at all. It means look for what's going to get you ahead and get there. Don't be so stupid that you allow people to convince you that a door to political power has the Republican label on it, so don't walk through it. If the door is a door you can walk through, take the power and worry about the rest later. You are not going to get me to say that I am not going to walk up the path that many other people have walked up to toward political power in this country. I'm going to stay out of politics because Pat Buchanan is in it. Then he will control the situation. Don't give me this. I am going to do what is necessary to make sure that my folks are represented at every level, in every party, in every walk of life. And if we've got to stop being so silly that we're manipulated into believing that if we give our allegiance to one party or another without having to ask for what they're doing for us lately, no other group in this country is expected to give knee-jerk allegiance in that way, and we're going to be taken for a ride if we do.
Phil, would you? You were. I noticed that you were rather interested in my question. We should say again that his opponent in this race this November is Barbara Mikulski, who declined our invitation to appear on our panel. Mr. Brown, sir, briefly.
Phil, would you think of ever asking a black Democrat why he or she is supporting a candidate who belongs to, attended white country clubs, a candidate who has stayed away from black people, although he depends on their race and so forth? There is no Democrat or Republican Party that is better or worse for black people. Neither party is doing anything
This makes Mr. Bin Wahad's point, doesn't it?
I said we need a third party. We need a way to strategically use both parties. But the inference is that when a black joins the Republican Party, you sound like one of the black leaders. It's sort of like you call their mother a name or something. You know, we need to be in both parties. We know the Democratic Party was the party of segregation.
It was the party of tacit lynching. It was the party that kept us down for decades, and we changed the party because we went into the party. We cannot allow Patrick Buchanan and his nativist, racist, sexist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic message to become the dominant majority party in this country.
And his participation at the convention should not exclude black African Americans from joining the Republican Party.
Alan Keyes should be rewarded and praised for going into a party and giving it a point of view he doesn't have.
Cornel West is a professor of religion at Princeton University. With time now short, let's go to his essay on what is wrong and how to fix it.
This is New Brunswick, New Jersey, on a Sunday morning.
But if our schools are going to be better, and if our housing is going to be affordable, if our government is going to be accountable, if health care is going to be accessible, if jobs are going to be available, we're going to have to work with some folk who don't look like us, don't think like us, but are willing to put their hands to the task and do some work.
The Reverend Buster Soares is the new dynamic pastor of First Baptist Church. His prophetic message of we Americans working together across race, class, and gender is crucial.
It's mandatory, it's not optional. People are going to have to move beyond the tribal zones that divide them, be they class or race or religion, and look at common dreams. Otherwise, this experiment will blow up in our faces.
In New Brunswick, as elsewhere in urban America, the tribal zones have all too often divided one community against another. When things go wrong and people get hurt, the divisions don't take long to surface.
A young white boy was shot over here on Nelson Street.
Right down the street?
Right down the street here. Right down the street. He was shot in the head. Right? It took them about 24 hours to catch the person that did that. My son, little Jason, was shot Saturday night. They still ain't got the person that did it yet.
In the climate of fear and distrust that racism engenders, common ground is often hard to see and harder still to reach. Sometimes, though, a community will discover the advantages of coalition. That's what has happened at the New Brunswick Memorial Homes, a low-income community on a prime piece of riverfront real estate.
Some people came together and decided that they wanted to do a redevelopment of the downtown area, which included market rate condominium, townhouse configuration, sort of a Georgetown style look. And they approached the tenant association basically saying, oh, we'd like to relocate everyone away from this area.
And it's just like being herded like cattle. Have you ever seen cattle being slaughtered? They're herded in a pen. That's the way we feel. We feel like we're being shipped out to the outskirts when we would like to better our own community.
Faced with the loss of their homes, the tenants group has sought support from other community groups with common concerns and common frustrations.
A lot of people don't see revitalization in the areas where their homes are. I'm not totally satisfied. I think that there's a lot to be done, again, in neighborhoods where this improvement has not quite reached.
Blanquita Valente is the first and only elected Hispanic official in a town 1/5 Hispanic.
345, 345.
Yolan Varga of the Hungarian Civic Association represents a community that has been part of the industrial labor force here for over a century. And Priscilla Daniels is a business owner and committee woman from the 4th Ward. All are part of a multiracial coalition that has become a player in the city's redevelopment campaign by connecting groups that have seldom before had much to do with each other.
Cooperation.
I feel a lot of the lack of communication that exists
between, let's say, Hispanics and Afro-Americans or Hispanics and Hungarians. It has to do with the lack of knowledge that we have about each other's cultural backgrounds.
I think the key ingredient that will bring success in New Brunswick and that will speak to the potential in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, is the mobilization of people engaging other people for the purpose of redevelopment. Redevelopment cannot be someone writing a check and sending it to an agency run by professionals on behalf of the have-nots. Redevelopment has got to be, at its basic level, people connecting with people. People from the suburbs who drive in to come to church here, connecting with people who live in public housing. Families with dads connecting with families without dads. Children who have computers at home connecting with children who don't have computers at home, so that we begin merging dreams before we consider merging agendas. When that happens, sometimes plans are blocked. When that happens, sometimes feelings are hurt. When that happens, sometimes names are called. But if we can suffer through the process, then we have some meaningful development and exchange, because human development requires human interaction.
Now, and you're talking about this within the context of the black church, within the context of the black community. Could something like that take place across races, black and brown and white and Asian?
Well, when it doesn't, then you end up with thousands of people living on the West Bank in isolation of an entire world. When it doesn't, then you have people shopping downtown in South Africa and not living downtown. When it does happen, then you have meaningful development, you have measurable progress, and you have significant change. It's not optional. It must happen. We cannot survive having one set of people saying Rodney King deserved what he got, and a completely different set of people saying, let's burn the sucker down because of what happened, living in the same country.
Government alone isn't going to solve these problems. The community alone isn't going to solve them. And the business sector alone. But together, I mean literally working together against some common objectives, and I think we've proven that here.
John Hellridge is a former top manager with Johnson & Johnson, New Brunswick's largest employer and a pivotal force in the city's revitalization effort. As head of that effort, Hellridge has learned some valuable lessons from the Memorial Homes experience, lessons about the limits of an either-or debate on self-help versus government assistance.
It's a balance between the two, because I think sometimes we move the pendulum too far either direction, because then if you move it too far this way, then it becomes a dependency problem. I mean, almost an entitlement problem. And I'm convinced from my experience that a community has to be committed to do something itself first. Then they need the support systems to do that, which then requires local government, state government, and federal government.
While the battle over Memorial Homes is far from over, the tenant organizing efforts, at least for the moment, appear to be getting results.
At this point in time, the plan to create the market rate development has been essentially halted by the success of the Tenant Association in getting a Hope One planning grant to examine the process of a home ownership initiative.
New Brunswick homes it's worth fighting for. It can be just as beautiful down here as it once was, and that's my dream.
Well, tell me what you think will be the case 10 years from now.
I haven't been to the mountaintop yet. I'm gonna tell you like Martin Luther says. He's been to the mountaintop and he looked over it. I haven't been there yet, but I'm climbing. All right? I'm climbing.
There is simply no place to hide. Either we decide to work together across the divisions of race, class, and gender, or the growing gap between the have and the have-nots threatens our collective survival. The promise of American democracy stays alive only when each and every American acknowledges that we are all part of one garment of destiny. And I'm wondering what you would say to young poor people, especially young poor black people now, at this present juncture in American history, as to how and why they should hold out for a sense of possibility and hope.
Well, because the blatant reality of slavery and racism and segregation was such that people who are still alive could never conceive of African Americans teaching at Princeton University, sleeping at Hyatt hotels, being on national television. This was inconceivable in our lifetime. And today, the world is completely different than it was for our grandparents. Not because they saw it, but because they believed it could be that. Likewise, for our young people coming up today, it can be impossible to see a different world. But the faith of our grandparents, if properly understood and properly attained by us, will cause us to see what we can't see and to believe that we can have something no other generation has had. Without that kind of faith, we just self-destruct or die. With that kind of faith, we press on to see what only God knows lies around the corner.
Professor West, sir, your piece is reminiscent of Martin Luther King Jr. and the 60s in its idealism. What a wonderful idea. Against what we've heard from this panel on this program, this is romantic, but about as effective as the wonderfully memorable strains of the hymn, "We Shall Overcome." This apparently this ideal cannot be realized against the kind of observations we've heard from this panel on this program. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, Phil, I don't believe that. One is because it's always been bleak for black people. And the fundamental question first is, how do you build on the best of the legacy of the black freedom movement, which is a moral issue. We have to look for higher moral ground and then look the realities of power in the face. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is ever since black folk have been here, our problem has been twofold. Too much poverty, too little self-love. To raise the issue of too much poverty means to raise the question, what is the distribution of power and wealth in our society? We live in a society in which 1% of the population own 37% of the wealth, 10% own 86% of the wealth. So all of those in this room are struggling for crumbs in a certain sense. You see. At the same time, too little self-love, the white supremacist bombardment that Brother Wahad and Sister Souljah are talking about is real. The white supremacist bombardment against black beauty, African beauty, against black intelligence, African intelligence, black capacity, black dignity. Those two are inseparable but not identical. Which means at the same time, and this is what I think when Martin King talked about we're part of one garment of destiny, it was a description of our condition. We don't choose circumstances in which we find ourselves. Right. The ugly history that this brother's talking about is real, but alongside that ugly history are Americans of all hues trying to hammer out democratic institutions because the higher ground is a struggle for democracy. And so the question becomes, no matter how bleak the situation, how do we keep alive our substantive and precious ideal of democracy in light of our present circumstance? And the way in which you do that is to create multiracial coalitions with higher moral ground, but looks at the realities of power and control and wealth. We have no other option, it seems to me. And I refuse to be discouraged. I refuse to be disempowered by anybody who comes along and tells me that we black folk, with our creativity, with our improvisational sense, do not have the moral courage to link up with other folk who are willing to get us out of the hell in which we find ourselves.
So that black people, brown people, people of all colors want to get to the same place. And as to paraphrase, in a general sense,
we're in a situation of conflict. We're in a situation.
Wait a minute. Don't we want our children to be happy?
We want to have food.
I'm talking about that. All right.
Okay.
Now, to paraphrase Senator Bradley of New Jersey, the state from which your piece was.
Senator Bradley gets much right when he talks.
He does, and he, among other things, and he's not claiming to be particularly original with the observation. We can't get there unless we go together. I have a terrible feeling that behind me are some people who do not agree.
Excuse me. Senator Bradley of the all-white United States Senate said we can't get there unless we all go there together. Sorry, none of us are where he is. That's number one. Number two, you're making a moral appeal to a country that doesn't have a moral conscience. The question becomes that when white people feel serious and angry and upset about abortion, they come out in the thousands up to the millions to say, this is what we believe about abortion. Where is the white outcry against white racism that murders African people all around this entire globe? It doesn't exist. So who are these white good people? I want to meet them. I want to see them. A few is not enough.
But that might be all we can get.
No. And guess what? I don't work with all I can get. What I work with is what I have. Listen, you have to have some confidence in the power of African people amongst ourselves to establish a foundation. We have. No, we haven't. We have utter chaos in our cities, and you've got to see that. There's no black institutions we can build? You can have a program. I'm not saying we've built a lot of institutions, and those institutions have not been effective. The majority of millions of African youth in this country are dying mentally, dying spiritually, dying emotionally, dying academically. And you may have a program, Mr. Brown may have a program, but what we got to talk about is an American government that tracks millions of African people who don't go to your program, don't go to Brown's program, millions of African people, not only here, but all around the world. And if we are not honest enough to say who are our friends, who are our enemies, to know what a friend is, to know what an enemy is, we will constantly be trying to get into people's parties, to shake our butts with them, to get them to like us, and that's not the question. The question is, what can we build amongst ourselves to secure ourselves from our enemies so that we will be able to survive into the future?
Mayor Kelly wanted to say.
That's not what I heard from Cornel West. There are lots of oases of hope in spite of all of what Sister Souljah says is true. And the sad and pitiful part of it is that the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news, most of the media never gives attention to it. And if that weren't bad enough, we know that maybe white America's not going to believe that there are oases of hope where people are empowering themselves as we have in Washington, D.C., Jackie West taking over her own housing, leading to her own ownership in a community. But the sad and tragic part is that our own community buys into that sense of powerlessness. We surrender to the power of the white man as if we were not the descendants of the first civilization, as if we were not an empowered people. That is the greatest frustration of all.
I never surrender to anybody, but I'm wise enough to know that if I walk out Washington, D.C. tonight, some black kid in Washington, D.C. is blowing off another black kid's head for a pair of sneakers because the institutions that we're talking about, not the things that we hold up to say, look, this is one example. The institutions that we're talking about are not saving the minds of those African children. That is the honest truth. None of these Negroes saved me. None of these Negroes
your mother didn't help save you?
None of them.
Now, you did it by yourself?
Listen. You know who saved me? A man named John Desane in Englewood, New Jersey, who told me who I was, who showed me my history, who told me who my enemies were, who let me know that this was not an easy world, who let me know that this was a cold environment, who let me know. No, what he's not a part of is dilly-dallying with the minds of African children and letting them know what the real situation is in America, where they will be killed if they do not know.
He apparently left out some very important facts. He apparently left out some very important facts, because I think that I hear everything that you're saying, but if you are going to tell me that in the course of this country's history through slavery, civil rights, and so forth and so on, everybody who's come before you sold us out, failed, etc., then somebody hasn't told you your history. If the white power structure in this country is going to be said to have destroyed everything black, then you are indicting black people as well. We were, in fact, and we are today engaged in a struggle. We are, in fact, and we were today, in many ways, and you can see it on the street, engaged in a kind of warfare in which our survival is at stake. But don't tell me we have won no battles in that war. None of us would be sitting here at all if some people had won.
I don't know if it's fair fair to suggest that she's saying there have been no victories.
It lacks integrity, especially from a black man in the Republican Party.
But
It lacks
wait a minute,
integrity.
hold up. Let's just make something clear here. This woman has never said that we're supposed to disregard our victories and just focus on the failures. You can't have no justice in this country without equality, and you cannot have in this country any peace without justice. So when you talk, when this man sits over here and tries to berate Sister Souljah and say that what she is saying, okay, is that we haven't accomplished anything, the woman is basically saying that before you can liberate a people, you have to first liberate your mind and stop kissing the behind of white Republicans and white Democrats and thinking that you getting ahead.
This must be the time for the president of Boston University, John Silber, to make what point, sir?
Well, I want to say that I think the claim that there's no conscience among the white people in America is a great example of racism. I don't think the face of racism is any prettier when it's black racism than when it's white racism. And I'd like to finish this. When Martin Luther King started his civil rights movement, he put his conscience before the American people and shamed an overwhelming majority of the white people by the strength of his moral argument. And the elevation of his moral argument was based on many of the things that he had learned from the individuals he cited in the letter from a Birmingham jail. Plato, Socrates, Jefferson, Augustine, Amos, Isaiah, Jesus. He recognized very well that he was fighting for the reform of a racist America on the basis of the views held by the dominant white society, and for that reason he reached them, and he so transformed them that you could pass the civil rights legislation under Lyndon Johnson.
That's such a lie. And there is no because of how his political position evolved. He was killed because he became more independent and more critical of the American
government. Why don't you let me finish? If somebody thinks that you refute what I have to say, if you think that you refute what I have to say by pointing out that Martin Luther King was assassinated, I can point out to you that Malcolm X was assainated.
That's not the refutation of what you're saying.
He was assassinated by a black man who hated white people.
No. Let me say this. Phil, I got to say this because we always go to white males to tell us what's happening. You see, let me tell you something. This is such a lie, a crock of crap. Because the reason why the United States, the only reason why the political leadership in the United States conceded to integration, conceded to civil rights for black people, is because the majority of the people of the world in the 1960s were ascending to political power and independence, and the United States could not claim moral leadership of the world and enslave black people in a system of Jim Crowism. So don't make like that Martin Luther King appealed to the better half or the morality of white America. White America did what was expedient politically.
Mr. Kozol wanted to say.
I just wanted to say this. I have sat on panels on television 25 years ago and heard exactly the same debate between white and black and within the ranks of black people. And that underlines what's on my mind today. I mean, walking in the poorest streets of New York and Chicago nowadays, looking into the eyes of these kids, I just think to myself, nothing has changed. So many years, so many lives. I know you like to end these shows on some kind of optimistic note, but I can't. I feel despair.
May I ask the panel to comment on this? Here's what I think you wanted to say, Professor West.
Yeah, see, despair is paralyzing. If it is as bad as we know and you say, that's precisely why we have to do something. That's precisely why rage, as real and authentic as it is, cannot have the last word. We are people of hope. That's why we go to church on Sunday. That's why we party on Friday. That's why we come to these kind of little meetings. Because we've got to find some hope in this situation. And the hope is grounded in and looking at the situation for what it is.
Dr.
Rage is not a marketable commodity.
As we started this program, I said there's been a lot of growth and a lot of change in the way people of different incomes, African-American people, live in suburbs and cities. And there's a lot to build on. I think Cornel West is right. I think you're too hard on him. I think Tony Brown is talking about things that are happening and can happen and that we can build on. I 25 years ago, I wasn't a member, but I was the research director of the Kerner Commission. And I do not believe that things are worse. And I think that we have a ways to go, and we've got to keep going. And I couldn't agree more with Cornell. Despair is not helping.
Yes, but I'll tell you what I do believe. If I get, my gray hair entitles me to say that 25 years ago I presided over similar events. And I do see somewhat of a difference, Mr. Kozol. We were, in those days, more into great society. Oh my God, look at the sins we've committed here. We're going to help you. With white, powerful, wealthy America. Now I hear more and more young people of Sister Souljah's age bracket speaking out to say, we've got to do this ourselves.
People get the impression that when you're an activist that you don't also do business, that you aren't also involved in programs, that you don't also attend church. You can do all of these things and still see the savage inequalities and the evil of this society. And the reason why we speak clearly and fiercely and strongly about it is because if we don't, you have people suffering in silence who never get the opportunity to be on the with Phil Donohue, who never get, see, we can't look at the world as the mayor of Washington, D.C., or as Cornel West, the author. You see what I'm saying? You gotta look through the eyes of the majority of your children, how they see the world, what they feel, the pain that they experience, how they would, how they would define things.
We are forgetting.
The evil is all over. Right now in South Africa, African people are in a system of slavery.
This argument is the same as 25 years ago.
Look at this dynamic. Look at this dynamic. I want people to understand this dynamic. You have a black man over here.
Yes.
He didn't cut nobody. Let me tell you, Stan. He didn't cut this guy off over here. He didn't cut him off talking about he walked through the ghetto. I live in the ghetto. I will cut you off now. So now he didn't do that. You see, what I want you to understand is this: is that it's very important that when we speak, at least when I speak, okay, I'm going to speak the reality of black people who don't have a voice. There's no such thing as freedom of speech in America. Okay, and therefore, when this man could talk about building grassroots organizations and power bases, and Tony could talk about recycling programs, and not one of them could probably name one black political prisoner that's a consequence of trying to do those very programs. And then this sister tries to point out, see, but I ain't gonna let you cut me off. This sister tries to point out some very basic and fundamental contradictions.
Is it possible that a cup of coffee between these various factions would allow all of us a meeting, a talk? Why the anger? Why?
You are interpreting intensity for hostility. And what I'm trying to explain to you is that if there's no freedom of speech in this country, when you do get to speak, you speak the truth, you speak clear, you speak fiercely, and you don't care whether you like it or not.
But the people who are really,
yes, Dr. Keys.
I just want to say very briefly, the people who are really forgotten. Sure, I think the people who are forgotten, especially in the black community, there are a lot of people out there who go to work, who take care of their families, who raise their kids. They are the people who are silently struggling against the odds, who have respected decent values, who have gone out, they haven't committed crimes, they are not in jail. The vast majority of black people have always been decent working class people, and I think that they are also the heroes of the struggle. I think they are also people who deserve our respect. I think they're also people who deserve a voice that will speak from their silence when nobody else is going to. And I don't care who calls me names. I will speak for my parents. I will speak for the people who did everything against the odds to bring decent folks into the world, who didn't commit the crimes, who just did the dirty jobs that nobody else would do so that we could move forward. I'll speak for them any day of the week.
I understand the anger. The anger is real, legitimate, and well-founded.
But it extends to you. It goes to...
Oh, I think that's part of the pain and anguish of our system. That so often that anger gets self-directed at our own community. And quite frankly, as I said earlier, to me it ultimately suggests that we give more power to the man than we give to ourselves. And I, for one, believe that we have the capacity, in spite of the odds, to be an oasis of hope, as Cornel West has pointed out, but in no way should that mean there should be any abdication of responsibility on the part of white America. White America owes us a lot, and I'm not going to walk away from demanding what she owes us.
You wanted to say?
Yeah, I want to say this word. I mean, just speaking personally, that I'm part of these kind of conversations all the time and have been part for 25 years. When I hear Brother Jihad put forward his view, I've heard that view. I can embrace the insights. I can criticize what I disagree with, but I'm looking for any insights I can. Same is true with Sister Souljah. The spirit of resistance that she has. Without that spirit of resistance, the hope that I'm talking about would be dead in the black community. Though I may disagree with a whole host of other claims she makes. So it's not in that sense viewing it as hostility. This is struggle. There's a sense of urgency. But I think I'm right. And I think I'm right in this sense, that after we move together looking for ways in which, not just justice, but self-affirmation of humanity, sense of self-confidence, all of those intangibles that are part and parcel of race and racism in America, that one will find that one will have to hook up with other human beings who are willing to take the risk and make that leap for the higher moral good.
May I ask briefly from the panel, and I beg you to be brief, where are we going now? Give us your own prescription here as to what should be done. May I please ask the entire panel to speak to that?
Well, no matter what the disagreements are, one common thread is clear. Power must be removed from the hands of centralized institutions and put back at the base of the pyramid in the hands of people at the grassroots. Whatever your analysis, everybody who has spoken here today, I think, comes to that common conclusion, and we got to work to make it happen.
Thank you for your brevity, Dr. Nathan.
I think we've got to build new, strong institutions in the community. They're out there. We can help them. We're doing it. We can do it better.
Sister Souljah, please.
To the African youth, that you have to educate yourself. Don't depend on black leaders because most of them are insincere. And don't depend on white America to embrace you because it will not.
Mr. Kozol.
I think white people have to spend more time talking about the injustices which we perpetrate. I'd like to see some books written in the future, not about the problems of the underclass, but about the psychological distortions of the people who created that underclass.
Ms. Smith.
I would agree and say that many veils have to be lifted, and this is why I originally started my remarks by saying that I think the issue of race is more than a black and white issue, so that we need to hear from more people because it is very complex.
President Silber.
I think the Founding Fathers were quite correct in noting the inadequacy of human nature and the importance of the division of power. For that reason, I agree with Alan Keyes that we've got to divide power and put it back in the hands of as many as possible.
Mayor Kelly.
I think America is on top of a powder keg that could tear us to smithereens, or we can begin to invest in our diversity and make us a real force in the 21st century, but we're going to have to start making that decision quickly.
I think that the foremost message that we have to address is that white America has to come to grips with its own conscience and its own moral corruption.
Mr. Monroe.
I think that while black people can and should do more for themselves, and while we have to look for coalitions, we must demand that the government of this country treat all of its people, provide opportunities for all of its people at the same level.
Mr. Brown.
Black people and white people are basically the same. Most of us are average. We have a few geniuses and liberal sprinkling of fools.
Democratic ideal is the most precious ideal in the world, but it's the approximate solution to insoluble problems, and therefore the cure for democracy is more democracy, and black people must always be democratic in form and content in their organizations and shoot for democratic ideals so that ordinary people can live lives of decency and dignity.
From the Cambridge Multicultural Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I am pleased to say on behalf of all those here gathered, a note of thank you and appreciation to those of you who stayed with us for this very, very serious undertaking. And to say on behalf of public television, we are pleased that you joined us. We hope that you found these 2 hours worth your time, and we say to you, farewell.